Hello, and welcome back to Whispers in the Void. There are places in this world, tucked away in the forgotten corners of our maps, that hold stories so dark, so profoundly disturbing, they curdle the very soul. They are places where humanity is stripped away, and a more primal, gnawing hunger takes over. Tonight, we journey to one such place. A place of filth, decay, and unspeakable acts. A place that came to be known only as the Rat Farm. The story you are about to hear is one of methodical madness and absolute terror. It is not for the faint of heart. So, lean in closer and listen. And if you appreciate tales from the abyss, consider subscribing to the channel. It lets the whispers know you're listening. Now, let the story begin. The lantern flickers and dies, plunging the screen into darkness. The sound of scratching intensifies, joined by countless high-pitched squeals. Then silence. A title card appears. The stench hit Deputy Miles Corbin long before he saw the farmhouse. It was a thick, gag-inducing miasma that clung to the humid August-era putrid cocktail of ammonia, rot, and something else, something uniquely foul that his 20 years in law enforcement had never prepared him for. He'd smelled death before, but this was different. This was the smell of death being used. The call had been mundane. A mail carrier, concerned about a fortnight of unclaimed letters and a god-awful smell emanating from the isolated property at the end of Black Creek Road. The place was known locally as the Blackwood Farm, though no one had farmed it for decades. Its sole occupant was Alistair Blackwood, a recluse in his late 70s whom most of the town had never seen. As Miles pulled his cruiser up the overgrown gravel driveway, the source of the sound that had been a low hum from the road became clear. A chorus of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of squeals, chitters, and scratches. It was coming from the large, dilapidated barn next to the two-story farmhouse. The sound was a living, breathing entity, a wave of unseen, frantic energy. The farmhouse itself looked like a haunted cliché, peeling white paint, boarded-up windows, and a porch that sagged like a tired old man. The overflowing mailbox was the only sign of recent contact with the outside world. "Mr. Blackwood?" Miles called out, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The only answer was the ceaseless chorus from the barn. He ascended the creaking porch steps, his boots crunching on dried leaves and what looked like old, gnawed-on-bones animal, he hoped. The front door was ajar. Pushing it open, he was hit by a fresh wave of the stench, now concentrated and suffocating. The inside was worse than the outside. Every surface was coated in a layer of grime and dust. Hoarded junk, yellowed newspapers, and filthy rags were piled in the corners. But it was the silence within the house that was most unsettling, a stark contrast to the cacophony outside. He cleared the downstairs floor by floor. A squalid kitchen with molding food. A living room where the furniture had been chewed down to splintered frames. Upstairs, he found the bedroom. And he found Alistair Blackwood. The old man was in his bed, a gaunt, skeletal figure under a thin, soiled blanket. His eyes were wide, milky, and vacant. His death appeared, at first glance, to be from natural causes. He'd been dead for at least a week. But that wasn't the horror. The horror was what lay on the floor around the bed. Dozens of large, sleek rats, their fur an unnatural, greasy black, watched him with intelligent, beady eyes. They weren't skittish. They were bold, almost proprietary. And on the floor were a half-dozen empty tin cans and a scattered pile of what Miles first thought was shredded cloth. A closer look revealed the sickening truth. It was human hair and fragments of bone, picked clean. A leather-bound journal lay on the bedside table. Miles, gloved and fighting the urge to vomit, picked it up. The last entry was dated 8 days ago. "The great work is nearly complete. My children are restless. They hunger. The flesh is temporary, but the lineage is eternal. The final vessel is prepared. Soon, they will feast, and I shall become one with the colony." A cold dread washed over Miles. Vessel? Colony? He backed out of the room, securing the house, and called it in. The dispatcher's voice was a lifeline to sanity. But Miles knew the real nightmare wasn't in the house. It was in the barn. When the sheriff and 2 other deputies arrived, the 4 of them, armed with shotguns and powerful flashlights, approached the barn. The noise was deafening now, a high-pitched symphony of hunger and agitation. Using a crowbar, Miles pried open the large sliding door. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, and what it revealed would be seared into his memory forever. It wasn't a barn. It was a factory, a slaughterhouse, temple. Hundreds of cages were stacked from floor to ceiling, each one writhing with a seething mass of rats. These weren't common field rats. They were huge, some as large as small cats, with thick bodies and unervingly intelligent eyes that gleamed in the light. Walkways and platforms connected the tiers of cages, creating a multi-level labyrinth. But the cages were only part of it. In the center of the barn was a massive, recessed pit. And suspended above the pit by a series of chains and pulleys were 16 large metal hooks, like those in a meat locker. 15 of those hooks were empty. One was not. Hanging from the last hook was what was left of a human body. It was impossible to tell if it was male or female. Most of the flesh had been stripped away, leaving behind a grotesque sculpture of bone, sinew, and tattered clothing. Below, in the pit, a roiling carpet of thousands of rats writhed and fought over the scraps that fell. The deputies recoiled, cursing and gagging. But Miles's eyes were drawn to something else. On the wall behind the pit was a large, meticulously painted chart. It had 16 names, each with a corresponding date. The first name, Daniel Miller, was dated 2 years prior. The last 15 names followed a timeline of horror. Alistair Blackwood was not on the list. Next to the chart was a series of levers and a grind-era large industrial meat grinder, its chute stained a dark, rusty brown. It fed directly into a trough that led to the central pit. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a farm. It was a processing plant. Blackwood hadn't just been killing people. He had been rendering them. He had been feeding his children. 16 names on the chart. 1 body on the hook. Where were the other 15? Miles looked from the grinder to the troughs, to the swarming, unnaturally large rats in the pit. The answer was horrifyingly simple. They were looking at the other 15 victims. Their bodies, their very substance, had been consumed and converted into this teeming, chittering biomass of pure nightmare. This was the rat farm, and the harvest had been plentiful. The next 48 hours were a blur of hazmat suits, forensic teams, and state investigators descending upon the quiet property. The farm was a biohazard of epic proportions. Exterminators, hardened men who had seen every kind of infestation, refused to enter the barn after the first team was swarmed by the hyper-aggressive rats, forcing a tactical retreat. The creatures were not just numerous. They were territorial and fearless. Miles Corbin found himself at the center of the investigation, not just as the first officer on the scene, but as the one holding the key to the madness. Alistair Blackwood's journals. There were a dozen of them, spanning over 20 years, found locked in a safe in the farmhouse cellar. While the forensics team painstakingly worked to identify the remains and trace the names on the wall, Miles delved into the mind of the monster. The early entries were lucid, if eccentric. Alistair Blackwood had been a brilliant geneticist, disgraced and fired from a prestigious university for unethical experiments. He wrote with venom about his peers, calling them cowards and fools, blind to the true potential of selective breeding. He had moved to the isolated farm to continue his work, free from scrutiny. His obsession was Ratus norvegicus, the common brown rat. He believed it was the planet's most perfect organism, adaptable, intelligent, and ruthlessly efficient. His goal was to enhance these traits, to create a new strain of hyperrat capable of advanced problem-solving and collective intelligence. October 12, 1998. They mock me, but they fail to see the elegance. Humanity is a flash in the pan, a temporary blight. The rat is eternal. It will inherit this world long after our cities have crumbled. I am not their enemy. I am their shepherd. For years, his experiments were confined to traditional methods. He designed complex mazes, introduced predators to weed out the weak, and carefully selected the largest, most aggressive specimens for breeding. But his work stalled. He needed a more potent catalyst for growth and intelligence. He needed a richer source of protein. That's when the journals took a dark turn. He began experimenting with animal carcasses roadkill at first, then livestock purchased from neighboring farms. The results were immediate. The rats grew larger, more intelligent, and disturbingly more organized. They began to work in concert, solving complex mechanical puzzles he designed to access their food. The first human victim was Daniel Miller, a drifter Alastair had found hitchhiking. In his journal, Alastair described the event with a chilling detachment, referring to Miller not as a person, but as Specimen A, or the first offering. June 4th, 2 years ago. An unexpected opportunity. A transient, no family, no connections. He would not be missed. The ethical dilemma is a construct of a lesser species. For the advancement of the colony, all resources are viable. I brought him to the barn. He was surprisingly strong. But my children were hungry. Alastair had built the entire system for this purpose. He'd lured his victims to the farm with promises of work or shelter. They were vagrants, runaways, prostitutes, people living on the fringes, whose disappearance would go unnoticed for weeks, if ever. The chart on the wall wasn't a trophy list. It was a feeding schedule. He documented each murder in meticulous detail. He described how he would subdue them, how he processed the bodies, and most horrifically, how the rats would react. He believed that by consuming human flesh, his rats were absorbing some aspect of human intelligence, a twisted form of Lamarckian evolution. Victim 9. A young female. The colony was ecstatic. Their cognitive leaps are remarkable. They can now operate the pulley system on their own if one of the chains should break. They learn. They remember. They are becoming more than I ever dreamed. As Miles read, a profile of the victims emerged. They were all ghosts long before they met Alastair, people who had slipped through the cracks of society. The forensics team confirmed this. Of the first few names they managed to trace, none had been reported missing. It was a perfect crime, hidden in plain sight. The most disturbing entries were the most recent. Alastair's writing became less scientific and more fanatical, more worshipful. He stopped seeing himself as a scientist and started seeing himself as a priest, a prophet for his new, squealing gods. He began to starve himself, believing that by purifying his own body, he could become the ultimate offering. They speak to me now, not in words, but in a collective consciousness, a chittering song that vibrates in my bones. They know the great work is done. They have evolved beyond the need for a shepherd. They only need one last thing to complete the cycle. They need their creator. The last entry, the one Miles had found by the bed, now made perfect, terrifying sense. The final vessel is prepared. Alastair hadn't been murdered. He had committed suicide by starvation, a final, willing sacrifice. He had intended for his own body to be consumed by the rats in his bedroom, a final communion with his creations. The 16th victim wasn't on the chart because he wasn't a victim in his own mind. He was an ascension. Miles closed the journal. The smell of old paper and dried ink mingling with the phantom stench of the farm that would never leave him. They had found the monster, and they understood his madness. But the horror wasn't over. Alastair Blackwood was dead. But his legacy, his children, were very much alive. And they were still hungry. The problem of the rats became a strategic nightmare. The barn was a fortress, and its inhabitants were an army. The state's pest control experts concluded that a conventional extermination was impossible. The rats were too numerous, too aggressive, and the barn's labyrinthine structure, full of tunnels and hidden nests Alastair had built, made a full sweep unfeasible. Any attempt to enter would result in severe injuries. The decision was made from a state-level emergency committee. The Blackwood farm had to be purged with fire. Miles stood on the perimeter, 100 yards away, alongside the sheriff and a collection of grim-faced firefighters and state police. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, which the fire crew had spent hours pumping into the foundations of the barn and farmhouse. Felt wrong. Felt like cheating. This was a crime scene, evidence of 16 lives brutally extinguished. But it was also a biological time bomb. Alistair's journal spoke of his children escaping, of their destiny to cleanse the world. No one was willing to take that chance. The order was given. A firefighter launched a single flare, an arc of brilliant red against the twilight sky, crashed through a hole in the barn roof, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a soft whoosh became a roar. Flames erupted from every window and crack in the old wood. The barn became a blazing silhouette, a monument to its own dark history. The farmhouse followed moments later. But the triumphant roar of the fire was soon joined by another sound. A scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was a million squeals of terror and rage, a single, unified shriek of a collective consciousness being burned alive. It was a sound of pure agony that clawed at the ears and chilled the soul. Then the true horror began. The front of the barn, its structure weakened by the inferno, collapsed outward, and from the breach poured a living tide of fire and flesh. Hundreds of flaming rats, their black fur alight, surged from the barn. They weren't fleeing randomly. They moved with purpose, a wave of burning bodies charging directly towards the perimeter. It was an attack. A final, suicidal act of defiance. Officers and firefighters shouted, falling back from the incandescent wave. The shrieking was unbearable as the creatures burned. Yet they kept coming, driven by an instinct beyond pain or self-preservation. It was a scene from hell, a vision of damnation made real. The charge faltered 20 yards from the line of humans, the rats succumbing to the fire that consumed them. They writhed and blackened, their screams fading until they were nothing but a carpet of smoldering husks. The fire raged through the night. By dawn, the Blackwood farm was gone. All that remained were two smoldering, skeletal foundations and the lingering smell of ash and cooked meat. Officially, the threat was neutralized. The case of the rat farm horror was closed. The 16 victims were given a proper memorial, their names etched in stone, a silent testament to the madness they had encountered. But Miles Corbin never forgot. He left the force a year later, unable to shake the images from his mind. He moved to a city, surrounding himself with the noise and light of millions of people, hoping to drown out the memory of the chittering darkness. Sometimes, late at night, in the quiet of his apartment, he thinks he can hear it. A faint scratching from within the walls. He knows it's just his imagination, the city settling, an old building making its noises. But he also remembers the final, chilling sentence from Alistair Blackwood's first journal, written over 20 years ago. The beauty of my children is their resilience. You can burn their nest, but you can never truly extinguish them. All it takes is for two of them to survive, two of them to find their way into the shadows, and the colony will be born anew. 5 years. For 5 years, Miles Corbin had managed to build a semblance of a life. He lived in a third-floor apartment in a bustling, anonymous city hundreds of miles away from the pastoral nightmare of Black Creek Road. He worked the night shift as a security guard at a sterile technology campus, a job chosen for its profound silence and lack of surprises. The concrete, steel, and glass were an intentional armor against the memory of rotting wood and packed earth. He had traded the chorus of squealing rats for the gentle hum of servers. He never talked about the farm. The official report was sealed, a document of such singular horror that the state had buried it under layers of bureaucracy. To the world, the Blackwood farm was a tragic but closed case of a madman's spree. To Miles, it was a wound that never healed. He suffered from crippling insomnia, and on the rare nights he did sleep, his dreams were filled with the stench of decay and the feeling of 1,000 tiny claws scrabbling just beneath his skin. He was drinking his morning coffee, the city's gray dawn breaking outside his window, when a small story on the local news broadcast caught his eye. It was a filler piece, a human interest story about the city's growing problem with its homeless population. A local shelter director was being interviewed, pleading for resources. "It's not just the cold," the woman said, her face etched with worry. "People are disappearing. In the last 6 months, we've lost track of at least a dozen regulars from the Triangle District. These are people who check in, who have routines. Now, They're just gone. The police say they've moved on. But I know these people. They don't just vanish. Miles felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. The Triangle was an industrial wasteland of abandoned warehouses and crumbling factories near the city's riverfront. A place where the forgotten went to be forgotten. It was the kind of place Alistair Blackwood would have called a hunting ground. He tried to dismiss it. It was a big city. People went missing all the time. It was a coincidence. His mind was playing tricks on him, drawing parallels where there were none. But a week later, a second news story aired. A city sanitation crew had discovered something gruesome in a sewer drain near the Triangle. The initial report was vague, citing only the discovery of partial human remains. But a reporter, hungry for a scoop, had an anonymous source inside the coroner's office. The source tells us, the reporter said with grim excitement, that the remains were almost entirely stripped of soft tissue. The coroner has reportedly never seen anything like it, comparing the damage to a piranha frenzy, but the bones show clear evidence of rodent teeth marks. Hundreds of them. Miles dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, the dark liquid spreading like a pool of blood. Rodent teeth marks. The echo of the barn screamed in his mind. The body on the hook. The pit. The gnawed-on fragments in Alistair's bedroom. He spent the rest of the day in a cold sweat, pacing his small apartment. Couldn't be. The fire had purged them. He had watched them burn. But Blackwood's words, seared into his memory from the journals, returned to him with the force of a physical blow. All it takes is for two of them to survive, to find their way into the shadows, and the colony will be born anew. What if two had survived? A pregnant female, perhaps? Fleeing the inferno, stowing away on a freight train or a delivery truck, traveling hundreds of miles to this new, sprawling ecosystem. A city with 1,000,000 dark corners to hide in, an endless supply of refuse to feast on, and a vulnerable population that no one would miss. It was the perfect environment. Driven by a compulsion he couldn't control, Miles took a leave of absence from his job. He was no longer a cop, but he still knew how to investigate. He started in the Triangle, a ghost haunting the ghosts. He spoke to the homeless, offering them cash and coffee for information. They spoke of the rats. The rats in the Triangle, they said, were different. They were bigger, bolder, and eerily quiet. They moved in organized packs, not as a skittish swarm. They spoke of friends who had vanished in the night, leaving behind nothing but a stained sleeping bag. One old man, his eyes wide with a terror Miles knew all too well, told him the most chilling story. His friend, another transient named Eddie, had been dragged from his makeshift shelter one night. "It wasn't one or two of 'em, man," the old man whispered, his hands shaking. "It was a wave, black fur, silent. They came for him like wolves, dragged him right into a storm drain. I heard him scream once, just once." Miles knew he had to go into the sewers. He bought a high-powered flashlight, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty machete. He found the storm drain the old man had pointed to. The iron grate was slick with a strange, greasy film, and the air that puffed out from it carried a faint, familiar odor. The smell of the barn. The smell of decay being used. He pried open the grate and descended into the suffocating darkness. The tunnel was a brick-lined artery of filth and shadow. The sound was the first thing that hit him. A low, constant chittering that was not the random noise of a normal infestation but the steady hum of a hive. Following the sound, he navigated the labyrinthine tunnels. He saw things that made his blood run cold. Nests made not of paper and trash, but of shredded clothing and human hair. A makeshift larder in a side tunnel, containing a pile of shoes, wallets, and a small, dirty teddy bear. This was a colony. It was organized. It was intelligent. He finally came to a vast, circular chamber where several large sewer mains converged. It was an old cistern, long abandoned. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by a grate high above, was the heart of the new nest. It was worse than the barn. There were no cages. They didn't need them. The rats, dozens of them, sleek and massive like the ones he remembered, were herding a small group of terrified, emaciated people against a far wall. They were acting as living fences, their movements coordinated, their intent unmistakable. This wasn't just a nest. This was a farm, a larder of living flesh. One of the rats, larger than the rest, with a long silvery scar across its snout, turned its head. Its beady black eyes, devoid of panic and full of cold intelligence, locked onto Miles. It didn't squeal. It didn't hiss. It simply watched him. In that moment, Miles Corbin understood. He hadn't escaped the rat farm. He had just been living in the quiet space between its echoes. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just moved. Panic was a luxury Miles couldn't afford. The alpha rat stare was a declaration of war. He backed away slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, never breaking eye contact. He retreated through the tunnels, the low hum of the colony following him like a death sentence. When he emerged back onto the grimy streets of the Triangle, gasping for air that didn't smell of death, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. No one would believe him. He was an ex-cop with a psych discharge for PTSD, telling a story about a subterranean society of hyper-intelligent, man-eating rats. They would lock him up. The people in that cistern would be forgotten, their disappearances written off, until the colony grew too large to hide. He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't go to the media. He had to fight this fire himself. His first call was to a man he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Sheriff Thompson, the man who had stood beside him as the barn burned. Thompson was retired now, but his voice was still gruff, still authoritative. Miles laid it all out: the news reports, the disappearances, the sewer, the living larder. He expected disbelief, pity. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "I never told you this, Miles," Thompson said finally, his voice raspy. But after the fire, state auditors went through Blackwood's financials. He hadn't just been buying livestock. 4 years, he'd been purchasing massive quantities of an experimental growth hormone and a specific, complex blend of nerve growth agents from a black market chemical supplier. The kind of stuff designed to accelerate neural plasticity. He wasn't just breeding them for size. He was breeding them for brains. The words hung in the air. This was the confirmation Miles both dreaded and needed. This was real. "What's your plan, son?" Thompson asked. "Fire worked once," Miles said, his voice grim. "But I can't just burn down a sewer system. I need to be smarter." Blackwood's journals. He mentioned their senses were heightened. Their sense of smell was paramount. Guided by Thompson's old contacts, Miles found his way to a grizzled, cynical exterminator named Sal, a man who specialized in large-scale commercial infestations. When Miles told him the story, Sal laughed. Then Miles showed him a photo he'd managed to snap with his phone in the Soera picture of the alpha rat with the scar. Sal's laughter died. He'd been seeing rats like that naturally large and intelligent for months. He had thought he was going crazy. Together, they formed a desperate plan. They couldn't use poison. The colony was too smart and would identify it after the first death. They couldn't use guns. It would be like shooting into an ocean. They had to use the rat's own biology against them. Working with a chemist, Sal knew a man who owed him a dangerous favor. They acquired several canisters of a highly concentrated, aerosolized capsaicin compound, mixed with a potent pheromone extracted from a ferret, the rat's natural predator. It wasn't designed to kill them. It was designed to create a wave of pure, instinctual, uncontrollable panic. To turn the organized army into a stampeding mob. Their plan was to herd them into a trap. The trap was an old, decommissioned gas main that ran through the lower levels of the sewer system, directly beneath the cistern. If they could force the panicked colony into that main and then ignite it, it would be an underground inferno, contained and catastrophic. 2 nights later, armed with pressure sprayers, climbing gear, and 2 remotely detonated incendiary charges, Miles and Sal descended once more into the abyss. The hum of the colony was louder, more agitated. They had been discovered. They worked their way around the cistern, planting the charges at the entrance to the old gas main. Then they climbed to the grates overlooking the central chamber. The scene below was even more horrific. More victims had been added to the herd. The alpha rat was there, directing his soldiers with an unnerving efficiency. "On my signal," Miles whispered into his radio. They opened the valves on their sprayers, unleashing a fine, invisible mist into the cistern. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single rat sneezed. Another began scratching frantically at its nose. A high-pitched squeal of pain and confusion erupted, and then the entire chamber exploded into chaos. The aerosol hit their hypersensitive olfactory systems like a chemical fire. The scent of their most feared predator, combined with the searing pain of the capsaicin, shattered their collective intelligence. The organized army became a mindless, shrieking mob, blinded by pain and driven by pure terror. They stampeded, a black tide of agony, away from the source of the smell and directly toward the only open escape route, the dark, waiting mouth of the gas main. The human prisoners, forgotten in the chaos, huddled together as the wave of rats scrambled past them. Miles and Sal watched as thousands of rats poured into the tunnel. The alpha, bigger and stronger, resisted the panic for a moment, its intelligent eyes looking up at the grate, right at Miles. There was a look of pure, calculated hatred in its gaze. Then it too was swept away by the tide. "Now!" Miles yelled. He hit the detonator. A deep, guttural thump echoed from below, followed by a roaring jet of sound as a column of fire erupted through the gas main, turning the tunnel into a furnace. The collective scream of the rats was cut short, replaced by the roar of the inferno. Miles and Sal scrambled to help the prisoners, dazed, starving, but Olive up through a maintenance manhole as the sewer system below them filled with fire and smoke. As Miles stood on the street, the sirens wailing in the distance, he looked down at the manhole cover, now hot to the touch. He felt no victory, only a profound, weary emptiness. He had stared into Blackwood's abyss twice now and had survived. Weeks later, the city was moving on. The official story was a methane gas explosion in the sewers. The rescued homeless were treated as survivors of a tragic accident, their incoherent stories of giant rats dismissed as trauma-induced delusion. The case was closed. Again, Miles Corbin bought a one-way bus ticket to a small, coastal town, a place with no dark alleys, no subway, no hidden places for a colony to be born anew. As he sat on the bus, watching the city skyline fade, he felt a flicker of hope for the first time in years. Then, the bus entered a tunnel to cross under a river. For a few moments, it was plunged into darkness, save for the rhythmic emergency lights. Miles glanced out the window at the grimy tunnel wall, and for a fraction of a second his blood froze. There, in the gloom, perched on a service conduit, was a single large rat. It was jet black, and across its snout, illuminated for a heartbeat by a passing light, was a long silvery scar. It wasn't looking at the bus. It was looking right at him. It turned its head and disappeared back into a dark drainage pipe. The bus emerged back into the sunlight. But for Miles, the darkness had returned. The fire hadn't killed the alpha. It had escaped. He knew then that this was not his victory. It was just a lost battle in a much longer war. He hadn't cleansed the world of Blackwood's legacy. He had just taught it how to survive the fire. And now it knew his face,